Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Willow never imagined herself as the kind of woman who would harbor vengeance. Her heart had always leaned toward compassion, forgiveness, and understanding, even when she was wronged. But that changed the day she learned the full truth, truth that unraveled everything she had believed in, truth that shattered the last fragile pieces of loyalty she clung to. And within that truth, one name rose above all others, etched in betrayal and bitterness: Sasha. The same woman Willow once saved in the most vulnerable, harrowing moment of her life, helping her through labor on a courtroom floor, holding her hand as she screamed in pain, shielding her from chaos with her own body, was now, in Willow's eyes, the serpent in disguise. Sasha, who had received Willow's kindness, grace, and compassion as if she were a wounded sister, had quietly and calculatingly taken everything Willow held dear. When Willow looked into Michael's eyes as he held the newborn girl Sasha had just delivered, when she saw tears stream down his face and his lips tremble with emotion, she didn't see a man witnessing the miracle of life. She saw a man in love. Not with her. With someone else. With Sasha. That was the moment Willow's world shifted from heartbreak to fury. Michael didn't just see Sasha as the mother of his child. He looked at her like she was the center of his universe, like she belonged in his future. And Sasha, with all her feigned innocence and soft-spoken humility, had managed to crawl into the cracks of their fractured marriage and expand them into chasms. Every whisper of reassurance, every pleading gaze from Sasha now seemed poisoned with manipulation in Willow's mind. She began replaying the past, each delay, each miscommunication, every moment Michael pulled away from her emotionally. And traced it back to Sasha's influence. It wasn't just about the baby. It wasn't just about Michael's emotions running high. It was control. It was sabotage. It was war. The slow, simmering rage within Willow ignited into something cold and deliberate when Michael finally confessed everything to her. He told her about the deception, how he never knew she had come to the clinic in Germany, how he would have met with her if he had known, how it was Drew who had paid off the staff to turn her away. Michael's voice trembled with during that time, Willow continued to play the role that everyone expected of her, the devoted mother, the dignified woman, the pillar of quiet strength in a storm she no longer believed in. She smiled politely when others complimented her poise. She nodded in agreement when people praised Sasha's courage for giving birth in a courtroom, as if Sasha had not only conquered pain but won their hearts through it. And when she saw Michael gently holding the newborn, his and Sasha's child, whispering words that once belonged to Willow alone, she remained composed. But beneath that placid surface, every smile she offered was a wound ripping open. Every compliment showered on Sasha rang like a warning bell inside her chest, urging her not to give in, not to forgive, not to forget. Willow knew she could not strike recklessly. She needed precision. Timing. The right moment. When the court of public opinion turned in her favor, when the law began to see clearly, and when Michael could no longer deny what had been unfolding right in front of him, Willow kept her mask in place while her mind worked relentlessly in the shadows. The pieces were still scattered, but she began to sense the pattern. It wasn't just betrayal. It was orchestration. It was manipulation, disguised as maternal instinct and happenstance. The truth began emerging when Michael, driven by his guilt and the nagging inconsistencies in the events surrounding Willow's failed visit to Germany, resumed his own investigation into the clinic incident. What he uncovered first seemed insignificant, minor anomalies, inconsistent testimonies, but gradually, the puzzle sharpened into something far more sinister. Several questionable financial transactions surfaced, tracing back to Drew. These weren't direct bribes or obviously illicit transfers. Instead, they were routed through shell accounts, one of which had connections to a former financial consultant who had once worked with Sasha during her period of financial desperation. Michael, torn between loyalty and growing suspicion, began to realize that the people he had trusted the most may have conspired to sever his connection to Willow. Every breadcrumb he followed led to Sasha's periphery, not at the center, never overtly guilty, but always there. Always involved. Always conveniently placed. And then Willow acted. She delivered a thick manila envelope to Michael, no confrontation, no plea for understanding, just documents. Inside was everything she had gathered: financial records, flight logs, security footage, timestamps, anonymous statements, and digital communications. It was damning. It was methodical. And it was impossible to dismiss. She didn't offer an interpretation. She didn't ask for anything. Just one note, handwritten and sharp: look closely. Then ask yourself who you really trust. Michael sat in silence that night, his heart a battlefield of love, guilt, confusion, and a rising sense of betrayal. The woman he had believed stood beside him in chaos now looked like she might have been one of its architects. The coincidences were no longer coincidental. The emotions he'd mistaken for comfort and support now shimmered with manipulation. He remembered the trust Willow had once placed in him, the depth of her efforts to protect their children, and how he had thrown all of it away, chasing stability in the arms of someone who may have engineered the very divide he'd blamed Willow for. As for Willow, she felt no satisfaction, only bitter validation. She had not acted out of malice. She had waited. She had endured the whispers, the judgment, the isolation. She had let Sasha bask in admiration while hiding the truth beneath a mask of grace. But now, that truth had begun to bleed into the light. And still, Willow did not gloat. She mourned. Not for Sasha. Not for Drew. But for herself, because there was a time when she had believed that love and truth were enough to protect a family, that doing the right thing would always lead to the right ending. But now, with the truth laid bare and Michael visibly unraveling from within, she understood that survival sometimes meant becoming someone she no longer recognized. In the deepest corners of her heart, there was regret, not for fighting back, but for ever trusting people who saw her decency as weakness. She regretted giving Drew the benefit of the doubt, standing beside him when she should have questioned everything. She regretted believing Sasha's wide-eyed gratitude, believing her pain was real, her tears sincere. In the end, Sasha had not simply taken Michael's love. She had taken Willow's peace, her future, and twisted it into a story where she was cast as the outsider, the villain, the inconvenient memory of a life no longer needed. But that was over now. The mask was cracking. The narrative was shifting. And as Michael looked across the room at Willow, truly looked at her for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't see a broken woman or a bitter ex-wife. He saw a survivor. A strategist. A mother who had never stopped fighting, even when everyone else gave up on her. And for the first time, he began to wonder if he had been trusting the wrong woman all along. In the cold, tense air of the courtroom, everything began to shift when Rick, who had previously set his sights solely on dismantling Michael's credibility, abruptly redirected his fire toward Sasha. It was a move no one saw coming. With surgical precision, Rick began to unravel a web of questions that no one had dared to speak aloud. He brought up financial inconsistencies, undocumented funds that had flowed through questionable accounts during the period surrounding Sasha's pregnancy. He hinted at conversations between Sasha and Drew that, while not directly incriminating, now painted a disturbing picture of coordination and strategy. He questioned the timing of Sasha's pregnancy, her rapid re-entry into Michael's life, and the convenient circumstances of her giving birth on the very floor of the courtroom during the most crucial moment of the custody battle. What was once viewed as a display of maternal heroism now began to feel like theater. Crafted, exaggerated, and perfectly timed to draw sympathy. Sasha, under pressure, began to stumble. Her tone, once measured and composed, grew strained. Her hands trembled slightly as she responded to Rick's increasingly pointed questions. She tried to hold her ground, to keep her story coherent, but the doubts had already been planted. The once clear narrative of a brave mother doing her best now appeared less certain, muddied by the suggestion of manipulation and hidden agendas. The gallery, once filled with murmurs of support, now shifted into uncertain silence. Eyebrows raised. Glances exchanged. The tide was turning. And throughout it all, Willow remained silent. She did not object. She did not gloat. She sat with her spine straight, her expression unreadable. Her silence was not born of fear, it was deliberate. A weapon. Every moment she did not speak was a choice to let the truth speak for itself. She had done her part behind the scenes, building the foundation, collecting the evidence, setting the dominoes in place. Now, she simply watched them fall. She didn't need to raise her voice to dominate the room. Her power came from restraint, from the quiet assurance that the truth was finally clawing its way to the surface. Rick's relentless attack continued. He juxtaposed Sasha's public image as a victim and a survivor against a trail of contradictions. He questioned the emotional intimacy she shared with Michael, the blurred boundaries between co-parenting and courtship, and the rapidity with which she had gone from a marginalized figure to the emotional centerpiece of Michael's life. Even the birth, once hailed as miraculous, was now laced with suspicion. Rick stopped short of outright accusation but made sure the doubt festered. Had Sasha used that moment to manipulate the court? Was it all just too perfectly timed? Sasha, caught in the storm, struggled to maintain her innocence. Her face, pale and glistening with stress, betrayed a desperation that had not been there before. Her answers lost the confidence they once carried. She looked to Michael for support, but for the first time, his gaze was distant, uncertain. That brief flicker of doubt from him struck harder than any of Rick's words. Sasha was no longer the unassailable figure of courage and grace. She was faltering. Willow knew, in that moment, she was winning. Not through violence, not through vengeance, but through resolve. She had spent weeks being underestimated, painted as the jealous ex-wife, the fragile mother spiraling out of control. But now, every move she had made in silence was bearing fruit. Sasha's mask was slipping, and the courtroom was finally beginning to see what Willow had seen all along. She didn't want Sasha destroyed, she wanted her exposed. She wanted everyone to understand that behind the soft voice and trembling hands was someone who had manipulated an entire narrative to gain Michael's heart and public sympathy. As the trial neared its end, the energy in the room shifted once more. Michael, who had once stood so firmly at Sasha's side, now looked across the courtroom at Willow, not with anger or disdain, but with something far more complex. There was a recognition in his eyes, a reluctant admiration. The woman he once dismissed as overly emotional now sat before him like a strategist who had played a flawless hand. She hadn't needed grand gestures. She had relied on truth, patience, and the ability to endure humiliation without breaking. She had become formidable. Willow didn't avert her eyes. She stared back at Michael, her expression calm but piercing. In her gaze was everything he needed to see. Every betrayal she had endured, every moment she had spent in the shadows rebuilding her strength, every ounce of pain she had transformed into purpose. She didn't need to say a word for him to understand that the woman he once loved had become someone he could no longer ignore. She had risen, not just from heartbreak, but from obliteration, and rebuilt herself into a force strong enough to shift the narrative of the entire trial. She knew the outcome might still not favor her. The custody decision could go either way. She could walk out of that courtroom with nothing. But one thing was certain, Sasha would never again be seen through the lens of perfection. She would no longer be the untouchable mother draped in sainthood. And that, to Willow, was a victory. She had taken back control, not through rage, but through reason. Through quiet, calculated resilience. Through an unbreakable will forged in the fire of betrayal. And in that courtroom, as the gavel neared its final fall, it was no longer Sasha or Michael who held the spotlight. It was Willow, no longer the woman who had been betrayed, but the woman who now orchestrated the reckoning. As the final day of the trial drew to a close, and the tension inside the courtroom settled into a brittle, suspended silence, Willow felt no triumph, only completion. This wasn't the kind of victory that came with cheers or celebration. There were no open arms waiting to congratulate her, no vindication that would erase the pain she had endured. It was a quiet, solemn acknowledgement that justice sometimes didn't look like a clean win, but more like survival laced with clarity. Willow hadn't come to reclaim a crown or to beg for affection. She had come to reclaim her dignity, to ensure the truth could no longer be smothered beneath pity-driven narratives or carefully curated performances. She rose from her seat slowly, composed, every movement deliberate. The courtroom, still echoing with Rick's final statements and Sasha's unsteady attempts at rebuttal, had become the stage for a different kind of reckoning, one not delivered by the judge, but by the collective shift in perception. No matter how the custody verdict landed, the damage was done. The illusion had shattered. The perfect image of Sasha had cracked beyond repair. And Michael, now fully aware of the layers of deceit that had tangled themselves around him, stood in the ruins of what he had once considered stable ground. He didn't look at Sasha as he once had. He didn't see her as a victim anymore, but as a participant, perhaps even a catalyst, in a plot that had cost him more than he ever realized. Willow didn't need an apology from him. Not anymore. His silence, his haunted gaze, his hesitation to even hold Sasha's hand as the courtroom cleared. Those were enough. They were the reflection of a man waking up far too late. She knew Michael would carry this for a long time, not just the consequences of the trial, but the guilt of abandoning the one person who had never stopped fighting for what was right. Maybe one day, he would try to make amends. Maybe he would reach out with trembling hands and words he should have said years ago. But Willow wasn't waiting for that. She wasn't building her life around what could have been. She had outgrown the need to be rescued, to be chosen. She had chosen herself. Outside the courthouse, the sky was dimming, casting long golden shadows across the pavement as Willow walked alone toward her car. Reporters buzzed, people murmured, but none of it touched her. Her heels echoed with quiet strength, every step a declaration that she was still standing, not just despite the betrayals, but because of them. She had become more than what anyone expected. Not the grieving wife, not the scorned mother, but something far more powerful, a woman who had learned to endure the storm and wield it. She would return home not to lick wounds, but to rebuild her future. Wiley and Amelia would know a mother who had looked darkness in the eye and refused to flinch. She wouldn't shield them from the truth, but she would show them what it meant to face it with integrity and resolve. Her legacy to them wouldn't be a sanitized version of strength, but one laced with pain, perseverance, and a fierce, undying love. As the courthouse doors closed behind her, so too did the chapter of weakness, of silence, of betrayal. A new one had begun, written on her terms, guided by her truth. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, one thing was clear: Willow was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. She had become the queen on the board. Unyielding, unafraid, and fully in control of every move that would come next.